Today I'm going to show you why 90% of new music producers don't know how to use distortion. And by the end of this, you will know how to use distortion, and you'll be able to use it to your advantage, creating crispier, more unique and characterful sounds. Okay, I've got a plain saw wave here with some distortion on it. I'm going to play it 3 different ways, and I want you to try and guess the difference between these 3 sounds. What's changing here is what we're feeding the distortion unit. You'll see over here, I've got only one type of distortion here, and that's Ableton Saturator set to this hard curve mode. And before that, I've got 3 EQs. Okay, so without any changes to the saturator and simply just feeding the saturator more low end by boosting the low end here with EQ 1, we get one type of distortion. Here where we start boosting more of the lower mids, here at around 200 Hertz, we get a bit more of like a kind of electro, kind of hollow sound from the distortion. And here at the last EQ, we are boosting here around 500 Hertz, which gives us even more of a different sound. Okay, and what if we start to kind of fine-tune this and move this around? So now that we understand the frequencies that we feed a distortion unit changes the character of it, you can now start to use the built-in features and your saturator or whatever distortion you're using to create some really unique sounds. For example, in saturator, it's got this section here at the bottom which has frequency, width, and depth, and it also has this bass. I want to focus more on this section because this is where we can start to get really interesting sounds. The depth on this is kind of like the gain on the EQH here, where it controls how much of this filter is being fed into the saturation unit. The width controls the narrowness of the band, like the Q over here, and the frequency controls the cutoff, like this. Let's jump onto a more commonly used sound, which is the kind of bass pluck over here. Okay, so we've got a saw wave over here, and that is just going through a filter, and the filter has an envelope on it, so we're getting this pretty standard bass pluck. It's also got a pitch envelope to give it a bit of attack. Okay, so here I've got the same saturation unit, and I've sat and tweaked those parameters until we get this sound. Compare that to if we had not used this filter section, setting the depth back to 0, we get a pretty boring distortion without any real characteristics to it. Okay, let's move on to something like a Reese bass. Here we've got this Reese bass that sounds like this. And that is just 2 sine waves with some sync window on them. And we've got some effects on here, just a bit of compression, some EQ, and a filter. But what this is lacking is that really nice, warm distortion. And so typically what somebody might do in this situation is use the built-in distortion here, which by default is set to off. We're not using any filtering. And they might turn up the drive and get something that sounds like this. So here we can use our filter and set it to pre. We set this to a band pass, and we start to distort it around 900 Hertz. If we want the low end to come back in, we can bring down the mix. Compare this to this. And again, playing with that cutoff frequency, you start to get very different sounds. Same thing with the Q, boosting the Q. So it really is just all about fine-tuning what you're doing before you're going into the distortion. Okay, let's move on to the next example. Here we have a basic pluck sound, which sounds like this. Okay, so now I want to use this basic ARP that I've made and show you how we can start using that cutoff filter on the saturator to create a little bit of movement and some really nice mid-range character in the ARP. Okay, so I'm going to turn this on here. And what I've done is we've got the saturator and we're doing 24 dB of drive on there. And then I've just got this LFO, which is mapped to the frequency knob here, and the depth is turned up. And this frequency is now kind of sweeping up between around 500 Hertz down to around 350. And so we start getting this really nice movement on there. Okay, so here's a multiband example. So typically when somebody uses something like Saturn, they might choose a sort of model to use here, distortion model. Here I've chosen lead amp. And then you turn up the drive and you might get something like this, which is kind of cool, but the Pluck's lost all of its dynamics. And, you know, in a more chilled kind of house tune, you probably don't want something that's super distorted. Maybe this would work in a more aggressive kind of track. And you might go, okay, I'm going to go for something a little less crazy, like a subtle tube. And that sounds nice, but it's not anything special. Let's go back to that amp, and I'm going to show you how we can use this amp to our advantage by using this multiband feature. Okay, so let's just click the plus over here, and now we'll go to this band and we'll just turn it off so that there's no drive and this area is unaffected. Now I'm going to start moving this cutoff frequency up until we get to probably around 5000 Hertz. And at that point, we're only going to be distorting the high end. And then we're going to get this really nice, subtle distortion on the high end while retaining all the dynamics of the mid-range and the clean sound in the mid-range that we had before. So here we go. Okay, so now I've got this nice little gritty high end, and I'm just going to show you a difference between without Saturn and with Saturn on how that sounds. Super simple, and it's just turned into a really nice, characterful sound. Okay, here's our final example, and this one is using Diva, which has some more unique kind of distortion capabilities. One of them being rotary, which has drive built into it. I'm not going to explain too much about rotary, but just know that you can use it to add drive if you didn't know that you could add drive inside Diva. Okay, so I've got a sound, and without any drive and without any feedback, it sounds like this. It's quite a nice sound, but it's kind of lacking a bit of dirt in it. So one of the ways we can add some dirt is we can add some drive to it. Now we've got this really nice growly mid-range, but I don't like that filter sweep. So what somebody might do is they might bring down the Q on the emphasis to get rid of that sweepy sound. So we've gotten rid of that sweep. But now the distortion or the sound is kind of just lost a bit of character. One thing we can do is add some feedback to it, and this is basically going to feed the sound back through the amplifier as far as I understand it, and that's going to add some nice like kind of growly character to it. Okay, so now the problem with this is we've got this kind of really loose and uncontrolled distortion that just doesn't really sound that nice to me. And if you remember when we spoke about the basics, it really matters what you're feeding the distortion unit. So if we start to bring that emphasis back up, we're basically going to be creating a big resonance on the filter that's going to be sweeping down again, and that's going to be fed into the distortion and the feedback. So now I'm going to just turn this back up. So let's compare that to before. So now we've got that sweep back in, but it's not just a resonant sweep anymore. It's got so much character, it's almost turned into like this deep, bassy, growly sound. So the sound before without any drive, and then with everything that we've added. Okay, and if we start to fine-tune this a little bit more, like if we start to make some adjustments to where that sweep is by controlling the envelope amount, we start to get so many different sounds out of just doing very basic movements to the sound. Okay, so now you can take what you've learned and apply it to really any sort of sound. It can be anything from vocals to your synths, to even your drum buses or your master channel. Alright, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next tutorial.